Goeiedag and welcome. My name is Amarinska and today I will be talking about 5 things I don't like to see in writing. This is a follow-up on my 5 things I like to see in writing video, and some of the things in here probably are direct opposites of things I mentioned in this video, and maybe sometimes I might have already mentioned it in that other video. Dislike number 1 I have is sentences that don't feel complete. They might be complete or they might not be. It might be accidental. Usually if it is on purpose I can see it and I don't really mind it. But if it's accidental, or if it is supposed to be a complete sentence but it just doesn't feel that way, then I don't really like it. And the same goes for grammatical structures that don't seem to be right, or like all that kind of stuff. Point 2 I don't like is world building that is complete yet somehow doesn't feel complete. The example I have for this is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. We have a complete enough world building for the story. The story does not get a lot bigger than where we are at the end of the book, and it just stays to one of the planets in our solar system. But it just feels like the whole hierarchy between the different groups of people is not explained well enough or deeply enough in the books. And even the world they are having their schooling on and stuff does not feel like it is very fleshed out. It's fleshed out enough for the story, but it just does feel like there is some stuff missing, because usually if you have world building, it's fleshed out. And the same goes for characters. Like, you have books in which character building feels incomplete, even though you basically know everything you have to know about the character for the story to make sense and to flow well. And knowing more would maybe even disrupt your reading experience or even spoil the fun in the story. And yet somehow it feels like stuff is missing that you should know. It's a feeling. Number 3, I know for a fact, is something that plays into one of the points in my 5 things I like in writing video, and this is flowery or overly flowery writing, in which I mentioned in the previous video that yes, I like poetic and lyrical writing, but not when it's overly flowery. I don't know if I mentioned that specifically, but to me poetic and lyrical writing is more so a conscious word of choice that creates a certain flow in a text which makes it easier to read and which makes it easier to express and feel certain changes in atmosphere and emotions in the characters. More so than overly descriptive flowery words or similes that don't really make sense for the context you were using it in. Which, by the way, that happens a lot. Like a book that has similes that do not only not make sense, but that you think, why did you add that in? You're writing a book. We know you know the words. You don't need to add a lot of flowery writing to prove to us that you have a big vocabulary. Laini Taylor is a good example of this, because I read her book Strange Dreamer, and somewhere close near the beginning we have visitors from the city of Weep to where our main character Laszlo Strange lives. So he taught himself the forgotten language of Weep, and when a native speaks it, it is described as something like, when he spoke the language, it sounded like calligraphy, if calligraphy were coated in honey. It's supposed to sound beautiful, but 1, something coated in honey is sticky AF. So how does that sound beautiful or clean or sweet? Like, it's supposed to sound sweet, but to me it sounds disgusting. And calligraphy is meant to be an art to be seen, not heard. So why do you use something that sounds sticky and disgusting combined with something that needs to be seen instead of heard to describe the sound of a language? I mean, that could have been said is this, when a native spoke it, it sounded like he was melodically singing or something like that. It could have been done in at least a half of the words, and it would still have been a fine sentence. I would have liked it way more, because this happens so often in a book. Like, it's not always annoying that she writes that way, but it's definitely overdone. And I have a feeling like I read over half of the book before I decided to stop reading it. But constantly I had a feeling that either in part the characters were out of weep. They call it different, but those characters are kind of stupid sometimes, because there is something hanging above their city and it's locked with anchors, yet they have never tried to move the anchors, for example. Anywho, the descriptions are so flowery and so extensive that it ruins the pacing of the book. It could have been beautifully written in a similar way with maybe 50% of the words, and then I would probably have finished the book, because then it would have been 250 pages instead of 500 and something. So let's go on to the next book, which is the complete opposite, which is simplistic writing. And I don't necessarily dislike simplistic writing, but if you do that, the world, the setting, and the plot and the characters need to be great. You don't need to have extensive lyrical, poetic, or even flowery writing to create an amazing story. The Warded Man is an example of this. Peter V. Brett writes extremely simply, it reads pretty quickly, and it's beautifully done. You get the atmosphere of the world, you get how dark it is, the demon cycle, by the way. You get the fear the people live in, and that is what creates the pacing. He needs to write simply in shorter sentences. They are not all short, but it needs to be paced quicker, because most of the time extremely scary stuff is happening. But that makes the writing easier to read and quicker. And in book 1 it's done great, because the setting is great, the character development is great, the characters are interesting, and the plot, like, everything is just done so well. It's one of my favorite books ever, but then, like, it's less well done in my opinion in the second and specifically the third book. The third book is just a romance cloaked as a horror fantasy book, which I don't like, because it's more focused on romance, sex, and love things than any other thing, even though it should be a war against demons who want to kill you. But barely anything happens except for the demon's perspective, which was boring AF to read. Like, I don't like the writing style when there is nothing to compensate in the plot or the characters for it to be, like, if everything is so simplistic, it could just as well have been a children's book if it weren't so brutal, you know? It's just, I have a feeling, I find those books decline in quality over time. And point 5 is feeling like information that was put in wasn't necessary to pack the punch. Like what I said in Laini Taylor's book, like, there is a lot of descriptive information that's been put in, but it doesn't feel like it is all necessary to tell the story. And actually, you have a feeling that afterwards you could have done it with like half or 2/3 of the book, and a lot could have been cut out, and the story could still have had the same or even more of a punch because you used less words to tell it. Which is also an example of this is another book of Peter V. Brett, which is the second book in the Demon Cycle, The Desert Spear, which starts with about 200 pages of backstory of a character we shortly meet in the first book, which in and of itself isn't bad. It switches a little bit between the past and the present, but it feels like a lot of the times it's quite repetitive. It could have been some things that were an entire chapter could maybe have been told in like 10 pages instead of 20. And the entire thing could have been maybe 100 instead of 200 pages. It almost made me DNF the book, even though the rest of the book was actually great. either should have been compressed and the entire story put into another novella or something, or a separate novel, because it almost felt like a different novel at the beginning of the book, or it should have just been shorter. I would not have minded if it was like another separate novel next to a very compressed version in the beginning of that book, because that would have been fun. And then you can choose if you want to know a lot more about that character or not. But I feel like it doesn't really make sense. Like, it doesn't really do anything for the character. I still dislike him. I disliked him more after that than before. And I think it was supposed to gain sympathy or something, like to understand his point of view, but that could have been done with literally 20 pages. Anywho, I will now stop to keep it relatively short. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, engage. Thank you for watching en tot de keer.